Hi, welcome to week 8 of Leadership in Diverse and Under-Resourced Communities. I'm Andrew Sears, and in this week we're going to be focusing on leading demographic and cultural organizational change. Now, I'm going to start off with a little bit of review since this is the last week. So the philosophy and design of this course is we give you content and reading, and then we want you to, first kind of remember and understand concepts. So that's with the live meetings and forums. And, we're having you do a lot of summary assignments and, going through the leadership experience, but we're not going in super in depth. Then we're having you apply different concepts of the making of the leader. And then you had your week 5 project where you're really looking through all the material you got from the leadership experience, evaluating that, and then, figuring out what makes sense for your organization. And then here at the end, we're really at the creative, so how do you use this to bring change in your organization? Now, again, just to review some of the reasons, the drivers for change, and actually, let me skip a couple slides ahead. Part of the theory that goes into this course is organizational design theory. And the idea behind organizational design theory is you have an environment, and that's going to, influence all these things: your strategy, your culture, your core processes, your leadership, your systems, and your structure. And then you're going to have results, and you want to have a feedback loop. But the idea behind organizational design theory is that organizational health and effectiveness depend on having all of these things aligned, not just things inside the box, but also with the environment. Now, this course is very focused on thinking about how you're aligned with your environment and how your results are aligned with your environment, because what happens if your environment is significantly different from when your current organizational systems were designed? So many ministries have been around for decades or 100 years, and the environment changes and the world's changing really quickly. So that's really what we're going to talk about is, these changes that are happening in the world. So, in the U.S., the demographic trends, looking from 1960 to 1950, you have a shift from, white population being 85% of the population to 47%. And then the Hispanic or Latino or Latinx population, 29%, and the Black population, 13%, and the Asian, 9%. Now, many of you are working in cities where this transition's already happened. One of the quotes I like is, "The future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed." Some of you are ahead of 2050 in terms of demographic changes. Some of you are probably ahead of 2100 in terms of demographic changes. Whenever I was in Boston, this change happened, I think, around 2000, where white folks became the no longer the majority there. And if you look at elementary age, I think they're only like 1/3. Now, this has happened globally. We talked about this with the growth of Christianity, that the majority of Christianity is now in the global south. They're non-Western countries. Now, another thing that's driving this change, and this course in particular has focused up to this point on racial and ethnic and gender issues, but also there are significant changes happening in the generation. So by 2025, this says that millennials will comprise the majority of the workforce. And in the U.S., there's these generational groups: baby boomers, and from 1946 to 64. So they're the green here. And then Gen X, which is I'm a member of, is 1965 to 1980, is now moving into the most senior leadership positions. Gen Y is starting to become the majority, and then Gen Z, and Gen Y usually is called the millennials, right? So that has big implications. So these generational changes have big implications. So one of the things that we've talked about is there's generational trends on priority of social issues. So this shows the generational trends, how important is race as an issue. So for boomers and Generation X, it's fairly important, but millennials and Gen Z, it's a lot more important. Same thing with gender equality. And then also an issue that's becoming more significant is around sexual orientation. And various organizations are going to have different responses. Evangelical groups are going to have a different response to that than, say, a secular group. So what are the key trends? What's happening in the environment? So the top three generational differences on social issues are differences across race, gender, and sexual orientation. Right now, donations today are still primarily driven by boomers. So I've seen a lot of organizations that they're like, we don't need to make any changes, racially, and that's because their current donors, that's not a priority for them. But ultimately, whenever donations are being driven by younger generations, that's going to become more important. And for organizations that uphold traditional view of marriage and sexuality, for a lot of evangelical organizations, a lot of our students come from evangelical organizations, it's going to be increasingly important to improve the racial and gender diversity of leadership to appeal to Gen X, millennials, and Gen Z donors. So ultimately, the summary is the environment's changing. So how does the rest of the organization need to, reflect that? In some areas, you don't want to, just take the changes that are happening in the environment. In other areas, you do. So how significant are the external pressures for change from the environment? And what this is kind of a bell curve where, different organizations are going to be at different points on this. Some of you are really at the cutting edge. I said the future's already here. It's not evenly distributed. Some of you are already at the cutting edge of the future being here, where there's a great need for change. So that might be cities like in the U.S., like Atlanta, Miami, Boston, San Francisco, or, countries like South Africa. And, some of the factors are going to are the majority of clients of a different race or ethnicity of leadership. That's going to become significantly more important across generations. Is the extended community and your city, is it going to be a different racial group than leadership? The reason why I use Atlanta is it's one of the most predominantly African American cities in the United States, and Miami is one of the most predominantly Latino cities in the United States. And whenever 90% of your cities is of a different race or ethnic group than your leadership, that's going to put a lot of pressure on you. And what's happening is younger donors, and this is honestly, I focus a lot on donors because that's the biggest thing that's going to drive a lot of organizations. I'm just being factual, and just being maybe not factual, practical. For a lot of organizations, that's going to be the thing that's going to drive this. Is that younger donors, including evangelicals in your region, are going to strongly value diversity in leadership. So then there's other people and other organizations that are in, and this is part of what I've learned with this course. We get students that they are in regions or cities that are predominantly serving white poverty. Like we have rescue missions in Montana, where 95% of the poverty, and where they are, it's white poverty, and so they have limited differences between the leadership and clients, and if they do, it's often mainly across social class or possibly gender. And if you're in rural Montana and your extended community is white and conservative, there's going to be less pressure on this issue. Now, that's just talking about, funding pressure, but ultimately organizations should make changes to follow your core values regardless of external pressures, right? And that's from, internal or external. Ultimately, you want to be true to who you are. So let me talk about a couple case studies of organizations that have made, have felt a lot of pressure and how they've responded. So Intervarsity Christian Fellowship. The environment is, so it is an evangelical or very Bible-based ministry that is primarily at secular schools. So they are on kind of the bleeding edge on a lot of these issues. And what the stance they decided to take was they decided to strongly promote gender equality and racial equality. Whenever I looked for books for this course, probably 70 or 80% of them came from InterVarsity Press. because among Christians, and not just evangelicals, but among Christians on race and gender issues, they're probably the leader. And they've become the leader because they've actually walked the talk, and they've really wrestled with these issues. They do have significant challenges in their funding model. Their whole funding model is that each InterVarsity staff member does self-fundraising, and that creates a significant racial and class bias. And I have a lot of friends in InterVarsity, and they're very aware of that. And they've taken some steps to have a portion of staff fundraising that goes to headquarters to be used to help supplement leaders from minority backgrounds to help improve diversity. But it creates their funding model creates a significant challenge to them. And they can't just change their funding model overnight, because if they did that, they probably wouldn't exist, right? So they also, with their evangelical focus, they focus their policies to affirm traditional view on marriage and sexuality. They took a lot of flack from that. They've banned from meeting on, quite a few liberal campuses, and there's been multiple, court cases around that. I believe that there's been Supreme Court cases. I can't remember what's happened, but with those, I think that they're currently in process. And they've had some groups, InterVarsity groups, that have left InterVarsity, often at the most liberal campuses. And, often those have kind of been on their own because there isn't a comparable organization to sustain them. So another example is a South African rescue mission. I actually spent a summer in 1993 there. It was in the middle of whenever apartheid was being dismantled, and it really followed kind of the old school rescue mission model. And the environment they faced was a radical change in cultural norms in a post-apartheid South Africa. Their leadership was disproportionately white as apartheid was being dismantled. And, roughly overnight, in a decade, basically the dominant culture decided to stop supporting pretty much all organizations that were disproportionately white in their leadership, if they're serving the Black community. And the dominant culture decided that the white-led missions mentality was a colonial mentality and just stopped supporting. So that was kind of funding pressure. There's also really what's happening, on the street. So I worked at a shelter for street children, and the whole time I was there, I remember that this organization, it was probably, if not the largest, one of the largest organizations, doing this type of work in Cape Town. And on any given night, there's 10,000 street children. So basically homeless children without parents on the street. And they had beds for about 50 children. And I kept thinking how this felt like a drop of water in the bucket. And I came back about 15 years later and I asked, how are all of these kids doing? And the guy who ran the shelter, he said, every single one of them's died. And I thought, that was really discouraging. So I asked his supervisor, the director, I said, what are you thinking about on the strategy with this? And he said, a few years after you left, we changed from a model that was just focused on, serving the street children to addressing the systems and reducing the number of street children on the street from 10,000 to 800. So a lot less would get to that situation where they had been, on the street for so long. And, what happened with that is they dramatically increased their focus on systemic change. They saw, the number of street children reduced from 10,000 to 800, but a lot of their programs either were ended or became independent. So they had to go through a significant change. Now, most of you are not going to be in an environment that's experiencing a change that's that quick. Some of you might be. So ultimately, the question is, how do you lead change? And, the title of this is demographic and cultural change. So how do you lead demographic and cultural change? So there's a change management model, and the basic idea behind this is you want to light a fire for change in step one. And most of what you're going to be doing in this project is focusing on step 1 and 2. Light a fire for change. So think about these steps as you're working on your project this week. So I'm trying to give you instructions for your project this week. Basically what I want you to do is, okay, how significant is the change? What are the demographic factors that are important for these changes? What are the cultural factors? What are the cultural factors that are in line with your values? What cultural factors that may not be in line with your values that you want to resist? And you light a fire for change. You get the right people on board. You paint a compelling picture. You communicate the change widely. You remove obstacles and empower people to act. You achieve and celebrate quick wins. You keep it moving, and you make changes stick. So ultimately, what we're wanting you to do is to take a systems approach to bringing your organization through this change process. So what does that look like? Now, we've talked about these 4 quadrants. For your organization, you're going to be focused on quadrant 3 and 4 because it is a collective entity. So these are just some example strategies. And, last year I saw a couple students, whenever they, designed their strategy, they basically copied this. Don't do that. That's, 1, plagiarism, and 2, the idea is you need to figure out what specifically does your organization need. But here's some of the things you can do to change the culture of your organization. So learn and train, learn yourself, and then train staff on cultural bias or whatever cultural changes that they need to go through. So promote ethnic, class, gender identity development for all staff. Try to get more diverse senior leaders to set the culture. Support affinity groups. So 2 of the groups I use as examples is women and minorities. It's very common for organizations to create affinity groups across generation. They'll call it the Young Leaders Group. That's not the only affinity group that you should have in many organizations. And some of this can be informal. It can be mentoring programs. It doesn't have to be, here's leadership for women, group. So thinking through, what could you actually do? And then the structural thing. So learn yourself and train staff on what are the structural biases that create. Set priorities for improving leadership diversity in your strategic plan. Develop policies to support women and minority leaders or whatever other factors that you have. Track diversity measures and have healthy revenue to invest in diversity. One of the things with World Vision, the reason why they do so well in diversity is they have healthy revenue, and then budget to invest in diversity. So to have a good, diverse leadership, a lot of people, they just jump to the finish line. They say, well, what you need to do is you need to get to the finish line as quickly as possible. Well, the reality is that you need to have, good diversity at every level. The military is a really good example, probably one of the best large example organizations in the United States. So at every level of the military, there's diversity across, race and gender. So that at every level, whenever you're, trying to figure out middle management, you have a lot of quality, diverse candidates at every level. So then whenever you're going for senior management, you have lots of strong women leaders, lots of, strong, leaders coming from a minority background. And ultimately, that's how you get there. So, one of the quotes that's often used is management guru Peter Drucker. He says, if you can't measure it, then you can't manage it. Or, sometimes people have said if you don't measure it, it doesn't matter. So ultimately what you need is just have diversity measures at every level. Now, a lot of organizations aren't going to say, well, we're going to, have affirmative action. Some organizations will say we're going to have affirmative action, for these things. But whether or not you do decide to do that, you should be measuring this. And then ultimately, you need to have diversity at every level for the leadership pipeline, and recognize that the values and culture will be set by those with power in an organization. I've seen a lot of organizations and a lot of groups are concerned about, are we going to get secularized through this? Well, the groups that I've seen, and I've seen a lot of groups that have gotten, organizations that have gotten secularized, and the number one group that I've seen that secularized organizations is the board, because it's those with power who set the culture and set the policies. And recognize, and I've added this number 4, that leadership diversity priorities will be in tension with other priorities. What happens in our courses is we're teaching you to put on a particular lens. And if you only look through one lens, then that's going to, distort things. So this is a lens. That's the lens that we're focused on this course, in this course. So throughout our courses, what we do is we want you to be a balanced leader. So if you had an organization and the only thing you thought about was marketing or fundraising, then you might have a lot of money, but you're not going to make a big impact. Or the only thing you thought about was accounting. That's not going to be a good approach. This is really in this quadrant. If you focus not enough on it, you're not going to be effective in the long term. If you focus only on this, then you're going to have a hard time even having the money you need to achieve the changes that you need in this. So ultimately, what you're looking to do is to have relational health, and we're talking about cultural health with that, but you also want to have funding health. The reason why World Vision has done so well is because it ultimately is in the short term, it's more expensive to be more diverse. If you take equal candidates and you take someone who is they're equal across all factors, and then you add cultural diversity, well, they're not equal across all factors anymore, because that person who has cultural diversity, they're going to have cultural competency in a domain that your organization needs. And all of a sudden, that's going to be more costly from my perspective. So ultimately, the funding health is really important. So operational health is important, and then innovation health. So the goal that you're trying to do as an organization is you're trying to stretch your cross-cultural limits to maximize your long-term mission effectiveness. So, where do you center your organization between being culturally close to your clients or culturally close to your resources? Ultimately, you're going to need to figure that out. But the point is you're trying to stretch your organization. So all this is kind of to frame the final project in this course, leading demographic and cultural organizational change. And the way we frame this is basically your supervisors asked you to develop a long-term strategy for your organization. You can decide, is this a 10-year, is this a 20-year? But you're reading the future demographic changes. You're seeing the current demographic changes. You're seeing the cultural trends. And how are you going to adapt to this changing environment? Some aspects you're going to say, okay, we have to adapt to it. Some aspects you're going to resist because you're going to say that cultural trend's not in line with our values. So you should focus on whatever factors might be important in your context. But I would encourage you to especially consider how racial and ethnic diversity and women in leadership. That's the focus of this course. We have other courses that focus on other things. So the first part is basically going to be a strategic plan to increase diversity and leadership. And then the second is going to be cross-cultural training plan for your organization, 3 to 6 pages. So we have more details in the assignment description. You can use a lot of the materials that we have in this course. And you can also use materials in our City Vision Institute website. So we have a lot of different courses that cover these things. So in addition to this course, you can find links on this course, including all the YouTube materials on this, and you can reference some of these things. You could say I want to use lesson 4 of this. We also have our cross-cultural management and ministry course that you could use some of the material from that course. So I'm really excited about looking at the material that you guys have. Even though I'm often not the instructor, I read what the students submit. And one of the last things I want to conclude saying is our goal as a university is to help you to adapt to the changes that are happening in the world. So we're not on some sort of political goal to get everyone to become Democrats, if you're in the United States, or get everyone to jump on the latest trend. What we do is we look at a lot of research and we see the changes that are coming, and that's a part of what we do as a university. We try to anticipate the changes, and we help you to anticipate them. So try to make this contextualized in your organization. Try to use it and apply it for whatever your organization's values are. So thanks a lot. It's been great having you in this course. And if you have any questions, please ask your faculty.